It's a good rule of thumb that every good idea has been done before, probably a lot of different times. This is where tropes are born. And contrary to what some think, I don't believe they are an inherently bad thing. At the end of the day, it really just depends on the execution. Follow the trope to a T, and the end result is bland and forgettable. Thoughtful remixing and reimagining, however, can birth a product better than the archetype it sprung from. There's a host of tropes I could use as examples of this, and today I want to talk about what might be my favorite one of the bunch: the corporate villain. So, what is the corporate villain? Well, oftentimes the corporation in question follows the same general traits as sterile and presentable outward facing appearance, protecting an unsavory center. Sometimes that unsavory center is a harmful discovery that, if not controlled, could result in some very dire consequences. Other times it's a collection of inhumane, nightmarish practices that, if discovered, could ruin the company's reputation. And oftentimes, it's both. Although having its origins as far back as the Industrial Revolution in novels such as The Jungle, my personal favorite examples of the trope come from some of its newest examples, those found in games. Through games, one can have a whole new level of interactivity with their narratives and with their villains. And what better way to start than one of the most iconic and earliest examples?
This laboratory has been engaging in dangerous experiments, and recently an accident has occurred. Anyway, this disaster cannot be made public.
The dichotomy between the familiar and the unfamiliar lends itself well to horror, and as a result, many examples of this trope fall within said genre. Perhaps none are as recognizable, though, as Resident Evil's Umbrella Corporation. A pharmaceutical company turned bioweapon manufacturer, the company is almost completely responsible for the events of Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, along with Zero, and Code Veronica, and Outbreak 1 and 2. And while certainly on the nose at points, its clear critique of the military industrial complex and the business of war certainly raises some very uncomfortable questions. As a concept, zombies are outlandish and unimaginable in the real world. Yet, phrased as the company phrases it, as simply another means to dispatch a population, it becomes clear that this fictional company is asking what's fundamentally different between something like a Tomahawk missile and a controlled zombie outbreak. Both are just as indiscriminate, both entirely destroy anything in their radius, yet one is seen as horrifying and the other as a fact of life, a product of the world we live in. To me, this is where a lot of the horror comes from, the cold, inhumane truth behind the inner workings of the company, hidden behind an almost comically PR-friendly veneer. Another element of horror to come from Umbrella is the question of control. Sure, the Raccoon City outbreak was planned, but can something like the T virus really be controlled? And if so, for how long? The hubris of corporate villains are often tested throughout the works they appear in, often to the world's detriment. And as we get a bit away from horror and towards the theoretical, we begin to see yet another example of Umbrella's line of thinking.
Morning, Mr. Freeman. Looks like you're running late.
Black Mesa is, in essence, the story of when the bounds of science are pushed farther than humanity is truly ready for. The company, named after its headquarters and the area of New Mexico that is in Albuquerque, has its toes in various disparate fields, often linking back to weapon development to fulfill government contracts. Yet, its most consequential field would come to be in theoretical physics, where one Gordon Freeman would eventually accidentally open a portal to another dimension and allow an invasion of Earth to commence. Unlike the previously mentioned Umbrella Corporation, Black Mesa appears to not even understand what they've caused, stumbling into disaster instead of creating it. Because of this, it's hard to even see the company in a particularly villainous light, especially compared to the invading aliens and the equally hostile military. Yet, it's through the lens of the latter where the company's culpability is put center stage. To the military, the scientists and the company they worked for played with fire, and as a result, the rest of the world got burnt. Considering what was to come for Earth after the Black Mesa incident, it's hard to really disagree with their points. In a sense, it was Black Mesa's cold and uncaring march toward progress that would lead to their doom. Cold and uncaring is actually a lot of what makes a corporate villain, making the result almost seem robotic. Because of this, it's only natural that both AI and corporation would meet. And conveniently, we don't even have to swap universes to see an example of such a combination.
We hope your brief detention in the relaxation vault has been a pleasant one. Your specimen has been processed, and we are now ready to begin the test proper. Before we start, however, keep in mind that although fun and learning are the primary goals of all enrichment center activities, serious injuries may occur.
Aperture Science is, or rather was, Black Mesa's primary competitor, the DreamWorks to their Disney. By the time of Portal 1, however, there's nothing but you, your sterile environment, and a voice over the intercom calling you fat. While in previous examples, you primarily saw the company's boring veneer in the past tense or in expanded media, in Portal, it's all in the present tense. Everything feels so stagnant, Jesus, what's the synonym for sterile? Yes, childless. It also feels incredibly lonely, which is likely why our companion was added to the mix. The other one. GLaDOS is the only thing left of Aperture Science, an AI obsessed with inhumane experimentation and murdering staff and, eventually you, with neurotoxins. Despite this, however, she remains the most lively part of the game, so human despite being a giant computer hanging from the ceiling. In GLaDOS, we see the personification of the inner workings of the corporate villain, the disregard for basic human empathy in pursuit of advancement, may that be in science or in profits, hidden in part by a cold, presentable facade. Aperture was not always GLaDOS, however, and the company was once led by a very different, yet in some ways very similar, lovable piece of shit.
Demand to see Life's manager! Make Life rue the day it thought it could give Cave Johnson lemons! Do you know who I am?
Cave Johnson, the fucking man, the myth, the best shower curtain salesman this side of Michigan. He founded and led Aperture for most of its existence, attempting to make his mark in the business of scientific research and always coming up a bit short. Portal 2 is a game that takes you through a number of different environments, with many of them being past Aperture labs as you and Potato GLaDOS make your way through the history of the company. Through the architecture alone, you see the degradation of the company from striving towards success to landing into bankruptcy and mediocrity. What really drives the point home is the inclusion of Cave Johnson himself as a replacement for GLaDOS over the intercom. In it, you hear the humorous, albeit sad, story of a declining mental psyche, a creeping inferiority complex, and the long-term effects of moonrock exposure.
Anyway, ground them up, mix them into a gel. And guess what? Ground up moon rocks are pure poison. I am deathly ill.
Cave Johnson is a larger-than-life loser, a man who should have never been granted a scientific research facility and an unrealistically large salt mine to build it in. In him, we see the failure of the corporate villain, the failure of Aperture. Even in his last invention, the ability to port a mind into a computer is one that was completed after his untimely death. A final failure, one that was remedied by forcibly porting his secretary's mind into it instead.
Artificial intelligence. We should have been working on it 30 years ago. I will say this, and I'm going to say it on tape so everybody hears it 100 times a day. If I die before you people can pour me into a computer, I want Carolyn to run this place. Now she'll argue. She'll say she can't. She's modest like that, but you make her.
Often, a villainous corporation will exist to fund one singular agenda, one big secret, one big test, one big weapon that it keeps from the rest of the world. Yet, what happens when there isn't one, but many different agendas? And what happens when the world is too lifeless to bother hiding anything from?
Good morning! Vault-Tec calling.
Vault-Tec is the architect behind the Vault program. a series of underground shelters created, at least on paper, to shield a portion of the American population from nuclear disaster, a scenario that became exponentially more likely as the 21st century continued in the Fallout universe. Before the Great War, 122 vaults would be built across the country, acting as a guarantee that the United States populace would live on. Except there was one issue. Only 17 of these vaults were built for the sole purpose of sheltering its population. The other 105 vaults would become giant social experiments to test how humans would react to certain extraneous circumstances to benefit a shadowy government organization that would eventually become the Enclave. Experimental flora being introduced into a closed environment, introducing an endless stream of white noise into a vault until the population eventually snaps. Gary.
Gary. Gary.
It's left unclear why exactly the Enclave needed this seemingly pointless information, but for all intents and purposes, it doesn't really matter. The old world is dead, and so is the Enclave for the most part. Vault-Tec is also dead, with the few vaults still in operation being operational in defiance of the company, not because of it. What Vault-Tec shows is the pointlessness of the corporate villain. The fact that in these abhorrent and unethical experiments, the data gleaned from it is of use to no one. Everyone it mattered to is dead. Vault-Tec, the government, even the remnants of said government. What was it for? At the end of the day, the experimental vaults became just another old world structure to loot, and another nail in the past nuclear coffin.
Good morning, Morgan. Today is Monday, March 15th, 2032.
Transtar is, in many ways, the culmination of everything discussed up till this point. Inhumane experimentation and attempt to control the uncontrollable, and the subsequent world ending disaster when the company's control faltered. What makes Prey's evil corporation stand out, however, is you. In every other example, you're either a cog, a lab rat, or an outsider looking in. There's no agency beyond what you can fuck up across your journey, but in Prey, it's a little different. You play aboard Transtar's private space station, Talos 1, and your playable character is Morgan Yu, the vice president and director of research aboard Talos 1. While experiments would be conducted upon Morgan, resulting in selective amnesia caused by mind-altering neuromods, they were conducted by his own volition. Furthermore, not dissimilar to Aperture's own history of volunteer testing, Transtar would bring their own volunteers to test on, either being subject to studies on the various alien life forms held on the station, or were subjects to neuromod testing, which honestly is more or less one and the same. The problem, however, arises when these volunteers are nothing more than prisoners from a still alive Soviet Union being given a choice between experimentation and forced labor, or death. Volunteers would be kept purposely in the dark, for if they knew the details, a normal death sentence would likely seem more appealing. Oftentimes, these prisoners would be imprisoned for such crimes as dissenting against the government, an action that in no way should lead to the death penalty. Yet, in the world of Prey, it does, and it's you that often signs off on it.
Look at me. Look at the man you're killing.
Mimic is in the tube.
Permission to release. Morgan?
What you do kills us both.
Release.
What makes your role as the corporate villain unique, however, is your own agency. You have no clue what happened before the events of the game, only finding out through secondhand accounts and the occasional voice clip or email from your past self. There's a clear disconnect between the vice president and director of research that led many innocent people to their deaths and the character you play as. Throughout the game, you're given a variety of moral choices, sometimes giving you no real incentive to do the quote unquote right thing. No incentive to stop being who you were. Yet you can. You can make the conscious decision to take the first steps to rectifying your past and find something a corporate villain almost never even seeks out: forgiveness.
And I like who you have become. You have my father's strength.
The corporate villain is absurd, cruel, and shockingly real. The world we live in today is dominated by international corporations ruled by individuals that seemingly get away with anything they could possibly do with good PR and humanity's inherent tendencies towards forgiveness. At times, it can almost be infuriating that the corporate villains of our world are as far from us as the stars in our sky. Through games, at least, there's pushback. The player is given the agency to make a difference, to fuck shit up, dance on the corpse of our corporate overlords, or maybe even find redemption in them. The corporate villain is one of my favorite tropes because it can instill horror, comedy, tragedy, but most of all, it can instill hope for a better future. Thank you for watching.